it seems to me if your CAE is not in charge of your budget, then someone else is, and they're not going to be as cute as you should be, saying, actually, we need to move our team forward. We need to spend the budget in the correct way.
This episode is brought to you by Green Skies Analytics, an audit analytics service provider that works with internal audit departments that have data analysts and are still frustrated with trying to make analytics actually work, aren't getting the expected ROI, who can't break through the communication barrier between the analysts and the audit team, and those that need experienced direction for an audit analytics strategy and process. Those that feel like they've wasted time and money on trainings, aren't getting the value they want, not prioritizing the highest risk areas for the organizations, or have projects that seemingly never get completed. Do you deal with any of that? If you do, go to the show notes of this episode and click the Green Skies Analytics link, or go to greenskiesanalytics.com to schedule a call and understand how Green Skies Analytics makes analytics actually work for internal audit.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Audit Podcast. I'm your host, Trent Russell, and today on the show, we have David Hill. Dave retired as the CEO from Swap Internal Audit Services in 2024 and is currently the Managing Director of HillAudit Training Limited. So connect with him on LinkedIn. Check that out. He's got a pretty stout team of folks that are working with him at HillAudit Training Limited. So definitely be sure to check that out. So on the show, Dave and I talk about complacent CAEs. Were they always like that, or did their environment that they landed in lead them to be that? So it's kind of like, did they come in as a CAE and they were gung-ho and we're going to do this and this and this and we're going to innovate and we're going to be great and wonderful, and then basically did the environment they were in, the organization, maybe the culture or leadership in general, kind of squashed that down and said, no, you're not. So that's a big piece of what we talk about, as well as there's this kind of overarching thing of how to get more budget, basically. Different strategies to do that, how to build a business case to do that, and probably obvious to most, but the importance of relationships when it comes to getting more budget. And so I don't know of an internal audit department in the world, or probably any department in the world, who is just like flush with resources and like, oh, you gave us too much, like just please take some back. That does not happen. And so I know it is especially hard on internal audit leaders. And so that was really one of the bigger goals of this episode, was to try to help you all navigate that. Well, that said, here we go. All right, Dave, I know topic that we wanted to hit on for sure was complacent CAEs, maybe where that comes from, some budget conversation within that also. Yeah. And I know when I wasn't a CAE, but I was the director and I was the leader of the internal audit department that I was at one point. And like I showed up and I was talking to the staff about conferences and training. And I was like, hey, which ones do you all go to? Timing, all that kind of good stuff. Like, is there industry specific ones? And they're like, we don't have budget for that. And I went,
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And I was in my late 20s, so I do nothing. And so I just went, okay, I guess that's how this works around here. And that was it. And so I think I can empathize with what we're going to speak to a little bit here. And I think a lot of other folks can as well. So I'm glad we have you on to help basically fight that complacency to some degree. So do you feel like those like complacent CAEs, if we say that, they're always like that? Or was it more like they come in kind of gung-ho like I was, and then, I mean, mine was in with a matter of weeks where it's just like, all right, I guess we'll just kind of do the same thing we've always done, and there's not a whole lot of change that we can be made here, especially when I needed the budget relative to the resources to make some really good positive changes. So what's your perspective on that?
It's interesting. I've been talking about complacency and chief audit executives for probably 3 or 4 years now, and I think my position is that actually I don't think anyone enters the profession to be complacent. I just don't believe that. I think most people enter the profession, and certainly when I'm speaking to younger professionals, they're excited, they're enthused by our profession, particularly what's happened over the last 2 or 3 years, even the last 12 months, and what's even happening today as we move forward with AI agents and all the other stuff. So I don't think anyone enters the profession complacent, that's for sure. I think where we are is that some people have become naturally complacent for various reasons. I know certainly in my sector it's because some of them are coming towards the end of their career. So why upset the apple cart? Why upset anybody? Why change things? People are quite comfortable with it. So there's that side of it, which I think is probably natural to an extent. And there's those, I think, that have been become complacent because they've been knocked down. They've been knocked down with not being able to innovate, not being able to be ambitious, not being able to change things from that traditional internal audit model to something much more agile and responding in a timely manner to things rather than trudging their way through a 12-month annual plan or even a strategic plan, 3-year plan. So I think some almost feel they've been beaten down. And, that sort of leads on to the discussion we're going to have about budgets. If you go to an audit committee and, they're not interested in discussing your budget, your financial budget with them, or discussing different ways of spending that budget, then again, that CA is going to leave that audit committee meeting feeling, a little bit down, a little bit disheartened, and, why beat the drum to actually give you a better service? Because that's really what they're trying to do. So I don't believe in some way anyone goes into the profession just saying, I'm going to be complacent. I just don't believe that. But I can actually see how it naturally happens because of lack of response from management or audit committees.
Yeah, I know. Even at the like staff level, there was someone I worked with. She was great, brilliant, like really, really good, super smart. And after a couple of years, she just left, and she went to a different part of the organization, some kind of finance role, I think. And I was talking to her. I was like, "What happened?" And she's like, I do the same thing all the time." There was no innovation. There was no push to be innovative. It was just basically come in, put your time in, and get out of here. And that was basically it. And she said she just wanted more from that. And I think I agree to your point. Like if you are further along, older, maybe in your career, maybe that is what you want. You just go, look, I got 3 years and then I'm done. I'm just going to punch the clock and get out of here. It's going to be stress free. I'm not going to learn analytics or AI or anything like that. It's not going to matter by the time I get out of here. So I can kind of understand that to a degree. But um, so with that said, though, what's the fix? How do we fix this? And who is the most accountable? I think I know the answer. I think everybody does, but I'd like to hear your thought on that.
Well, I actually think the CAE is actually completely accountable. A complacent CAE leaves it's so many risks for the organization. It means that whole team will become less proactive, looking for risks in the future. They'll lack in innovation because that's what happens if you're not leading from the top and demonstrating that spark to improve and innovate. Then it affects staff morale. So staff morale, you'll have leavers. So what you'll then find, fortunately, when I was chief executive of SWAP, we didn't have that, but you'll find that the complacent CAE will have an effect on both your recruitment and retention. So all these things have a multiplying factor, and then it will feed off into reputation. That's not really where we need to be. And if you compare that to that ambitious CAE, you're going to do the opposite of everything. You're going to see a team that wants to innovate, that isn't afraid of taking risks. It isn't afraid of messing around with dashboards and messing around with AI and messing around with, root cause and, thematic risks, rather than just continue just producing audit reports because they were in the plan. So I think a complacent CAE is just quite dangerous for that internal audit team, that organization. So
I didn't, I didn't think about the recruitment piece of that, but yeah, I've seen that also where it's basically let's just go get a body to put into the seat as opposed to let's go get someone that we really feel like is going to bring innovation to the department or some sense of change or some or even just a positive attitude. I've definitely seen that, and that person that I have in my head left within a year, and so now you're back to starting over, but. You've said innovation a couple times, and so I made note of that because I've always thought of you as one of the more innovative thinkers in the profession. I think you jumped on Agile sooner than most people did. The one-page audit report, I know, some other kind of out there ideas that maybe we can hit on. But I know recently you were talking about the one-day audit. Which
yeah,
that's the first I've heard of that. I know you and I had talked about it to some degree, or I know I'd seen you talk about it in maybe the past year, but recently you were talking about it again. And so I know we're talking complacent CAEs and all that kind of stuff, but let's give them an example of potential innovation. And innovation doesn't have to be we tried this and it worked. It could be maybe this one day audit thing, and you go, we're going to try it, and if it fails, there's still going to be lessons learned from it. And if it's a success, then great. But so just real quick, what is this one day audit? If you could speak to that.
well, I think I talked about it a year ago. I think I talked about it longer than that actually. But recently there was a post on LinkedIn talking about the average time it took to take, they said an average audit, which is probably wasn't the best use of words, but it was something like, and my memory might give me, but it was something like 360 hours, so something like 10 to 12 weeks. And I'm thinking, what are they doing? That is too long to communicate results, risks, everything to the organization. So, I think audits should be broken down into smaller units. And if you take something like accounts payable, it's always a standard audit you look at. Accounts payable, if you've got access to the data, if that's taking long in the day, I'd be looking at you saying, why is it taking long in the day? Particularly with all the tools you've got now, throw it up into AI, get your matches, get your outliers. You should be able to give a degree of assurance around accounts payable or any of those sort of financial ones specifically within the day. That would be my say. If Director of Finance came to me and said, I need some assurance around, that particular system, I think we should be able to do it in a day with everything lined up. So I'm not saying that's going to happen, commonplace. But if people think like that, so people think, actually, let's try and get this done in the day, instead of saying, well, I've got 6 weeks to finish this audit off, so there's no rush on my part, is there? Then, it's mindset for me. Set the mindset, set the challenge. Because if you don't, you become a complacent auditors. I've got 6 weeks to finish this. No rush here. So that's my kind of thinking about it. Set the challenges.
Yeah, and I think there's whatever the principle is, and maybe this is where you got the idea from, but it's basically if you give somebody 2 weeks to do something, they're going to take 2 weeks to do it in all likelihood.
Yeah,
If you give them a day, they're going to try to do it in a day.
exactly. Yeah, it's definitely mindset for my viewpoint. That's where it sits.
And I can't remember, I saw that poll too. It was on LinkedIn. I can't remember who posted it though. Maybe it was
Kyle,
Hal Garen. I'm sure he commented on it, or Norman Mark. So if anybody wants to go through all their posts and see where it was, but there was even like, I forget the percentage, but it was a high percentage of people that was like 700 plus hours.
yeah,
That
yes.
one blew my mind.
That's not an audit, as far as I'm concerned. That's not, almost like an implementation project. We're implementing a new financial system, and when you give you so many hours, I mean that's what it felt like to me. It felt completely wrong. Now I'm guessing some of this would maybe be SOX compliance audits, whatever, or it could be different sector audits. So geographically, it could be big, but nevertheless, if your mindset is thinking about actually delivering results and assurance on far more quickly than 700 hours,
Yeah.
then you're starting at a much better point to actually complete that audit in a timely manner. 700 hours is ludicrous.
I think to your point, it was not a very well crafted question. And I think the questioner said as much in the comments, because like you said, like, well, what is an average audit? Like there should have been a little bit more detail to be able to answer that question. And so, yeah, you could be right. Somebody's like, well, yeah, SOX takes us thousands of hours or something. So that makes sense. So I know in reading your article from Audit Board that you wrote fairly recently, we'll link to that in the show notes. You talked about even just CAEs understanding their budget, or even, and we'll get to how to ask for more for sure. But what did you mean by that? Expand on that a little bit.
Well, I think my point was, and I think there are different examples in different sectors. So I'm really focused on my background, public sector. And it's very evident to me that, having spoken to lots of CAEs over the many years, that many are either not the budget holders or don't really understand their budget. And I'm talking financial budget, what I'm talking about here. So what that means to me is that they don't understand their budget, and therefore they can't have that sensible conversation with management or the audit committee about how that budget is spent. And I spoke to a group of CAEs last year, and what was quite shocking to me was half of them, there was about a group of 8, about half of them didn't know their budgets. Or let me just clarify what they meant by that. They knew their budgets, but they thought their budget was the organizational chart, i.e. my establishment, i.e. my team, equating to the number of audits or the number of days I had to deliver. So there was never any talk about how can we actually look at my total budget and say, actually, let's have a bit more expenditure on training. Let's have a bit more expenditure on technological advancements and AI, and then present that to the audit committee and say, this is where we should be going. Because it seems to me if your CAE is not in charge of your budget, then someone else is, and they're not going to be as cute as you should be, saying, actually, we need to move our team forward. We need to spend the budget in the correct way. And so for me, that was quite a surprise that people didn't have that grip of their budget moving forward.
And I think you mentioned also there's some independence issues with that. If they are effectively owning and controlling your budget to that extent, then that can limit your
Absolutely.
independence. Yeah.
Absolutely. And in fact, in my last year at SOP, we had one of our partners that wants to reduce their budget by 50% in 1 year, and then the further 50% the next year. That completely, in my view, ripped our independence away because, as CAE, I should be going to the audit committee and saying, this is the coverage I think you need. Now, they're within their rights to say, no, we can't afford it or whatever it is, but we should be able to present that to them and saying, this is the coverage we think you need. And that was, that's ripped from underneath you because the budget wasn't held. It was held by someone else. So,
And
yeah,
I know one of the things you offer as a service is reviewing of the new standards for organizations, and you also speak to, hey, there is a play to be made with leveraging the standards to effectively
absolutely.
get more budget.
Yeah, absolutely. No, one of the things in the standards, but particularly in the EQA, is talking about maturity level of organizations, of internal audit teams specifically. It talks about them going from level 1 through to level 5. And for me, the other there's that going on, which has been about for some time, but I think is a merge of various maturity models. So I think it took ideas from the ambition model, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that, and there's also the requirement to have an audit strategy moving forward as well. Now, I see that as and also there's a requirement to understand your budgets. That's also within the standards. So what a good in for a CAE now to say, let's build into an audit strategy around moving from where I am in maturity level scale to where I need to be, and then above. So what I mean by that is that they would do an assessment of where they are against the maturity model. Am I level 1, 2, 3, or 4? Where do I feel as a CAE we need to get to? And try to leverage the organizational support about where you should be getting to. Because if you get acceptance that, we want to move, say, from a 1 through to a 5 to the optimizing level, then you've got a good in with the audit committee and CLT, the management team, to actually, to get there, we need to look at our budget in a much, in a different lens to actually say, how do we actually get there? And if we get that agreement, then we can then move forward and actually, start heading towards the moon and actually going above the optimizing level and doing things, even cuter and smarter and better for the organization. And this goes full circle to what I was saying is, if you sit there at audit committee and you present an audit strategy with all this ambition and innovation, all for the end game of improving the service you're providing that organization, and they turn around and they don't like it or they don't support it, then you become, dismissive, you become complacent, and, you may well leave. So, yeah. But I think that's the tool I would probably use, is that audit strategy, the requirement for the audit strategy.
Okay. Can you, I guess, summarize that again? Because I think this is one of the most important how-tos that we can kind of hit on this. And so let's say you are the CAE, and you're going to go through this process effectively in mind to get more budget to provide greater assurance. But let's say it that way. What exactly would you do? How exactly would you do it? What would be your talk track even? Like, how would you present this and who would you present it to? How would you get the support from any given stakeholder you might need? Because a lot of times going in with maybe your chief audit officer or your CFO, like whoever you have a good relationship with, you can leverage that and go, hey, we're coming in this together almost. We see that work a lot of times. So how would you do that?
Well, I think it's something that's always been about an internal audit. You've got to build those strong relationships. I mean, that's the key. So strong connections with your key stakeholders is absolutely crucial to get any of this through, because you've got to be, trust advisor, trusted partner, all these things that we talk about. So you've got to build that relationship, because otherwise, if you haven't built that relationship and you've just taken audit strategy to audit committee, they're going to look at you with glazed eyes and think, what's this all about? So you always have to invest some time in advance before that strategy becomes, a record in front of the audit committee. So, target the influential figures. Always have open lines of communication with audit committees. It's really got to be not every quarter when you meet. It's got to be ongoing. Have these relationships. Showcase items where you maybe have other audit shops that have actually done this stuff. They've done the investing in AI. They've managed to reduce maybe their resources, but actually the outputs and outcomes are much greater because they've changed the way that budget spend is done. So for me, it's It's understanding the standards, understanding where you are on the maturity scale, having a real clear roadmap which you communicate, and almost I would probably say get an agreement before it goes before to audit committee. So get your key stakeholders on side before you get to that position, because sometimes at audit committees there isn't the time to debate or discuss in full. So actually, if you have those discussions outside of audit committee and you've got the buy-in from the chair and maybe other key stakeholders, director of finance, whoever you report to, I think that's the way I'd approach it. You
Okay.
almost want to go in there like you've won.
Got it. What about the idea that some CAEs feel like my budget's set in stone, I cannot ask for more? What would be your reply to that?
I think that's complacent, and that's the problem. That's complacency. You know, I know for a fact, certainly in our sector, that quite often budgets are cut across the board. It doesn't matter what service you provide. If they want to make 5% savings, they'll go to every budget and they'll say, let's take 5% off every budget. Now, for me, if that's a CAE, he should be doing the exact opposite. He should be fighting his corner and saying, actually, if you let our budget stay as it is or increase our budget, then you're going to really increase the value that internal audit can provide. Now, a true story, this one actually, is one of our partners when I was at Swap, they wanted to cut our budget by, I think it was 35%. But actually, we worked with them, and actually, we then agreed to put in some software which was to support them in their kind of counter fraud techniques. So we worked with them to do that, and actually, our budget remained the same. So discussing with stakeholders, discussing alternative solutions, if you can really demonstrate the benefit of retaining or even enhancing an internal audit service for the betterment of the organization, you've got a fighting chance, in my opinion. But you've
I
got
like
to be able to explain it.
the talking point of if we're reduced, let's say the 5% or even greater, if you decrease that, let me start that over. Uh, if the initiative is for everyone to decrease their budget by 5% across the organization, couldn't you argue from the internal audit side, and I think I've seen this before, where you could say, if you're decreasing everywhere else, that increases our risk overall. Therefore, at a minimum, we need to maintain ours rather than taking ours away.
Yeah, I think you could. I think quite often that will fall on deaf ears, quite frankly, because they tend to think politically, that's what we're doing. But what you could do as a CAE is two things on that basis. You could obviously argue that the risk is increased and therefore, we need to keep our budget or increase it. But I think the other way of looking at it would be to say, okay, fine, we've had to take a budget cut. How do we still deliver the same with that budget cut by, spending our budget in a different way? So I could almost turn on its head saying, if you want to give us a budget cut across the board with everybody else, we need to look at our budget because we are concerned that you still need that assurance we're currently providing and some wider assurance. So we need to enhance our tool set, our toolkit to be able to still give you that assurance you need. So another win maybe to change the way you spend your budget.
Let's say that someone's listening to this, CA is listening to this, and now they're empowered and they're like, okay, great. I needed this. I'm going to go ask for more, do whatever I need to do. And it's unlikely, I would say, that whoever they're asking of just going to go, yeah, sure, here's the check. Why didn't you just ask years ago? There's still likely going to be some degree of pushback, especially depending on how large that ask is. So how could they deal with that resistance?
Well, I think resistance, it's always going to happen. I mean, that's something we have to deal with. So I think as a CAE, you have to kind of stay resilient and hold firm with your beliefs. So you have to continually advocate what you believe is the best for the organization in terms of, internal audit function. I think you have to be very articulate in what you're trying to achieve. What's the purpose of these changes, so that actually people can really see the tangible benefits of this change. I think the big bang approach doesn't work. I think you have to introduce changes reasonably gradually. So, you've got history to look back on, so you can start with maybe small incremental improvements, but then you've got the proof of concept moving forward. And I think the only other thing I probably wouldn't be afraid to do is just actually provide workshops. Provide workshops for audit committee members and stakeholders, something that maybe is away from the audit committee, because sometimes, as I said, there's not enough time within audit committee to really, dig deeper and actually say, what are you actually saying here, Dave? In this case, what are you saying here, Dave? What are you actually asking for? Because there's so many other items on the agenda that it become crowded. So I think workshops away, if you can, is not a bad idea as well. And I think I said earlier on, Trent, sharing success stories from other organizations that have actually been through that, I think is also a really good way of demonstrating success.
Really good. Yeah, I like that idea too. Especially if you compare it to competitors to some degree. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I asked a CAE one time, I said, what's the, a quality that every CAE needs or something to that effect. And like, usually when we talk about it at like a staff level, even it's like curiosity is usually one that, crops up and they go, yeah, the curious auditor makes for a good auditor or something like that. So it's basically like what makes for a good CAE. And very bluntly said, you have to sell. Like you have to be able to sell. Um, and I thought that was a very honest answer because it's true. But most CAEs don't come up with a sales background. That's not it. And so, what do you think about the idea? Because we get asked this a lot also in the services we provide on the analytics and AI front. Um, and so, vendors or service providers that you may need to go to your stakeholders and go, hey, we need X budget in order to have this service provided or this software or whatever it is. The service providers and the vendors that you're working with, they are salespeople. They have to be. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in business. And so I'm always a fan of the CAEs going, hey, we want that. We want that tool. We want that product. We want that service, whatever it is. Can you help me basically put together the business plan, the proposal that I could share with them? So leveraging their expertise and their background in sales to help get that for them. I mean, we had 2 weeks ago, someone said, I need this.
Yeah.
How do you usually sell it to CAEs? Help me put that together so that I can then take it to our stakeholders. So how about leveraging those folks to help get it is what you ultimately need?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know when we were Swap, we changed our GRC system. They actually wrote for us, like a business case as to why we would want to move and why we'd want to spend additional monies on in the new system. Really helpful because they know what they're talking about. They know that the art of the sell. And then we could look at that a document between two of us, just manipulate it, change it, make it more palatable for the audience that it was going to. But absolutely, yeah, because that's what they're there for, aren't they? They're there to sell the product, and they do it very well.
Dave, the floor is yours now. I'll leave it to you. What do you want to leave the audience with?
Well, I think I'd leave the audience with, as a CAE, as anybody joining our profession, always remain ambitious, always remain excited about our profession. You are going to get frustrations. You are going to get times in your career where you are up against either complacent teammates or complacent managers or bosses. Ride the storm, if not leave, because you've got to fulfill your own ambitions in this profession because it's such an exciting profession to be in. So, you'll know me. Most of you will know me. I've started my own business now, so website's there. If you want to have a chat with me, I'm happy to chat to anybody about anything at any given stage.
Hey everyone, thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Audit Podcast. Whatever platform you're listening on right now, I'm sure there's a subscribe button somewhere, so please hit the subscribe button there. If you're listening through iTunes or Spotify, feel free to go give us that 5-star rating. It only took me about 16 seconds to give myself a 5-star review, and it really helps to get future guests to come on the show, so we'd really appreciate that. Lastly, be sure to check out the show notes and follow us on all our social media channels on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and on TikTok. Also, if interested, please sign up for our weekly newsletter from the Audit Podcast. Thank you all. Have a great one.